Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Tax in 10 with me, Rachel.desouza, and Andrew.Robins.
Rachel, like millions of people, I've been equally horrified and fascinated by the ongoing saga of the sub-postmasters, the whole miscarriage of justice. Now, this is obviously not the place to discuss how and why it all happened, but there is one little corner of the case that got me wondering from a tax point of view, and which actually I think has much wider implications than you might expect. So we know that the Post Office offered a fixed amount of compensation to sub-postmasters who meet various criteria, and they also have the option of seeking compensation on a personal basis. My question is, when they get their compensation, will they actually have to pay tax on it?
Oh, for heaven's sakes, that's typical of you, Andrew. You can't hear a good news story without thinking about tax. Mind you, having said that, I think you do raise a really pertinent question, and actually it's one that we come across surprisingly often. Of course, on the face of it, it would seem, common sense to say that nobody receiving compensation should suffer tax on the payment, because really that is adding insult to injury. However, you may not be surprised to know that HMRC do not see it that way.
And to be fair, when you think about it, it's not actually as obvious as it looks at first glance. So let's come back to the Post Office in a bit, but I want to start by thinking about another example which involves policemen to explain the issue. So there was a case a couple of years ago where police officers successfully claimed compensation for underpaid overtime and similar things. The total compensation for all of them amounted to £4.2 million. And on top of that, the police also agreed to pay £1.2 million of legal fees. When you think of that case, it starts to make sense as to why that £4.2 million would be subject to tax. After all, if it had been paid when it should have been, it would have been subject to income tax in the normal way. And there's no logical reason why you would then say it should be tax-free just because it was paid late. The surprising bit to me was that HMRC also taxed the claimants on the £1.2 million of legal fees, even though they never saw a penny of it because it was paid direct to the lawyers. Now, the case went through the tax tribunals, and the first one did find in favour of the claimants. But ultimately, the case went against them because the court reached the conclusion that the payments of the legal fees by the police was directly linked to the officer's employment, so was effectively a benefit in kind.
And there are lots of situations where compensation is paid and the tax treatment might not be what you would expect. And it's well-established HMRC policy, for example, that if you receive compensation for the damage of an asset, you are treated for tax purposes as if you had made a part disposal of that asset, and that means you could have capital gains tax to pay. It's also well established that where you receive compensation, say for loss of trading profits because there's been a flood, and that's simply because I left my taps on upstairs, then that compensation that I received is itself treated as taxable trading income. So let's think about this a bit more. How are insurance payouts treated? For most of us, these are generally going to be exempt from tax, but for different reasons than what I've just explained above. If you claim on your car insurance, for example, whilst technically the receipts are treated as a part disposal, of course, there's no tax because cars themselves are exempt from CGT.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if you are making a claim on your health insurance policy, it won't be taxable because the payment you receive is not income and doesn't derive from a capital asset. On the other hand, if your daughter's boyfriend put his foot through your Picasso, the insurance payment would be treated as a part disposal of the painting.
And what would his health claim be after I punched him?
Yes, indeed.
So that tells us, I think, that as usual, tax is complicated. But let's go back now to the sub-postmasters. In a lot of cases, they were forced by the post office to make good the alleged shortfall of takings. And one part of the compensation they will now get is to reverse those making good payments.
Mm.
Another part may well be to compensate for wrongful imprisonment and the whole horrible miscarriage of justice. Now, under the original government compensation scheme, compensation related to the shortfall of profits is taxable, and the element related to the miscarriage is exempt.
And I have a real issue with this because the shortfall compensation doesn't derive from trading income, to my mind, because the whole point is that it's giving the sub-postmasters their own money back. However, the tax treatment is so well established that in the post office scheme, the government has recognised, this mischief, or it feels it, unfair or what have you, and they have decided to make additional payments to effectively make good the money that's been lost through the tax.
This leads nicely onto other situations where it feels like the taxpayer is not being treated fairly. It's quite common, for example, for shareholders to fall out, and that can lead to one or more being forced out of the company. At the extreme, you can end up with litigation where the ousted shareholder seeks to get their fair share for the shares they've had to give up. Now, you would expect the cost of that litigation will be deductible against the compensation received. After all, the only reason you had to pay the legal fees was in order to get the payment due to you on your shares. Unfortunately, that's not how the law works. And because broadly speaking, the legal fees do not enhance the value of the shares, so you don't get any relief on them.
And there are other areas where the treatment of receipts is really unclear, such as payments for whistleblowing and payments made by government departments to informers. Now, in some cases, the payments will clearly be income, but it's really easy to imagine situations where that description doesn't fit at all. And in those cases, it's actually really hard to know what the right treatment is.
Yeah. And finally, except in those rare cases where public opinion is so outraged as to force the government to act, as with the postmasters, the result of all of this is that payments being made to compensate you for damage you have suffered will end up being worth much less than you think. In the worst case, you could find yourself with most of your payment disappearing in tax and professional fees, leaving very little to actually compensate the person who suffered harm. So I'm afraid the moral of this is that you need to take account of tax at a really early stage to make sure the compensation you ultimately get in your hand is really what you deserve.
Yeah, very true. Anyway, on that sobering point, have you got something of a recommendation for us this week, Andrew?
Let's go to something much more cheerful.
Good.
I've been catching up on the iPlayer on BBC on the Genius of Everyday Life, which is presented by Hannah Fry. I've mentioned her before. She's incredibly charismatic, really enthusiastic presenter. And in each episode, she takes an everyday item like the Hoover or a microwave or running shoes and pulls them apart to work out how they work. It's really fun. It's very engaging. It's really interesting sort of science and technology and engineering. Very light touch, really, really interesting, sort of easy watching, but really informative too. So Genius of Everyday Life.
Okay, I think I might give that one a go. Fabulous. Thank you for listening to us. Now that's me, Rachel.desouza, and Andrew.Robins, and we're tax partners at RSM. Do let us have your comments and feedback, and we can be contacted on rachel.desouza@rsmuk.com or andrew.robins@rsmuk.com. Bye for now.
Bye.